The city of Newcastle upon Tyne is renowned for its vibrant nightlife, iconic Tyne Bridge and Quayside, rich industrial heritage and friendly Geordie culture. However, despite its positives, Newcastle and its surrounding areas, like most other places, also have a darker side, a side that is often hidden from view, a side that tells the unfortunate tale of debauchery, murder and death. And it is this side we are going to be focusing on in today's video. From an evil madman who brutally raped and murdered an innocent woman and got away with his evil crime for years, to a brutal monster who murdered his own partner and children in cold blood, I have gone through and researched Newcastle and its surrounding areas' most brutal, evil and twisted murders to showcase to you in this video. These murders shocked the northeast of England as a whole, leaving the area reeling and its people themselves in utter disbelief. And as always, I have chosen cases that were not always covered widely in the media, so knowing that you most probably haven't heard of many, if any, of these cases. Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if your idea of a good time includes good wine and true crime, then you're in the right place and you're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready because it's time for more true crime. As a side note, I do realise that not all of the cases in today's video are strictly in the city of Newcastle itself, but I have decided to include cases from Newcastle and the wider area of the northeast beyond the boundary of the River Tyne, simply due to the fact I have tried to cover the most heinous, lesser known cases in the area, but still close to Newcastle as the major city. Now, let's get on with the video. On the outskirts of Whitley Bay, in the quiet North Tyneside village of Easden, the early hours of Good Friday the 21st of April 2000 should have marked the end of one life chapter, not the end of a life entirely. Sarah Cameron was 23 years old. She was bright, ambitious and standing right on the edge of everything she'd worked for. Sarah had recently completed her studies at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne. She worked part-time in local bars, was well-liked, well-known, and just days away from beginning what friends described as her dream job, a role connected to the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. Her bags were practically packed. Her future already felt real. On the night of Thursday the 20th of April 2000, Sarah went out in Newcastle with friends for farewell drinks. Nothing reckless, nothing unusual, just one last night before her life changed. Sometime in the early hours, she said goodbye to friends and made her way home alone, travelling back toward Whitley Bay by metro. However, due to the actions of an evil monster, she never made it back to her front door. What later emerged in court was chilling in its simplicity. A man named Michael Robinson, who had chanced upon her as she made her way home on the same metro train he was on, had followed Sarah after she left the train. He stalked her through the quiet streets toward Easden, and then, when the ideal moment came, he pounced, dragging her through a hedge into a muddy field just yards from her home. There, Robinson threw Sarah to the floor like a rag doll and attempted to with one hand holding her down, he tore clothes from her body as she struggled against him. As she fought for her life, Robinson, desperate to gain control, began to punch Sarah repeatedly in the face. Over and over he hit her, with each sickening thud reverberating in the midnight air. Suddenly, as Robinson was beginning to overcome Sarah's struggles, the noise of people nearby spooked him. Not wanting his monstrous deed to be uncovered, he placed his hands around Sarah's neck and squeezed hard. Sarah, who at this point was weary from the horrendous ordeal, could fight only momentarily before falling into unconsciousness. By the time the sun rose on Good Friday morning, Sarah Cameron was dead. At approximately 9:30 AM, neighbours discovered her body lying in the field close to her flat in Easden, North Tyneside. The scene was brutal. The shock was immediate. A postcard quiet village was suddenly the focus of one of the most disturbing murders the North East had ever seen. Northumbria Police launched a major investigation. Officers combed the area, friends were interviewed, the public were appealed to for information. But days turned into months, and months turned into years, and the murder of Sarah Cameron remained unsolved. For 4 years, her killer walked free. Then, in 2004, a chance encounter with police would reveal the evil killer's identity. The break in the investigation didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from a witness. It came from chance and stupidity. In 2004, in New Haven, East Sussex, Michael Robinson, a bus driver and former soldier, was arrested for criminal damage after violently battering on a neighbour's door. As part of routine procedure, police took a DNA sample. That DNA was entered into the national database and it matched the semen recovered from Sarah Cameron's body. Just like that, a 4-year silence was shattered. On the 17th of February 2004, Robinson appeared at North Tyneside Magistrates Court, charged with Sarah's murder. He was remanded in custody and would now finally face justice. When the case reached Newcastle Crown Court, the full horror of Robinson's inner world emerged. He admitted the murder. He admitted the attempted rape. Psychiatric evidence revealed he had developed long-standing fantasies involving and violence, and the court was told he had even stalked other women before Sarah. After his arrest, Robinson confessed during interviews with a psychiatrist, laying bare a pattern that showed this wasn't random. It was escalating. In October 2004, Robinson stood in the dock at Newcastle Crown Court to be sentenced. The judge, Mr. Justice Henriques, described him as exceptionally dangerous. Robinson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years before parole could even be considered. The judge stated that the starting point would have been 24 years, reduced only because Robinson had pleaded guilty. Although the feeling was that the sentence was too lenient, it was at least some reassurance to know that this monster was now behind bars. But no sentence could restore what had been taken. The life of a promising young woman with hopes and dreams and a future that should have stretched far beyond a muddy field in Elysium. In Walker, Newcastle upon Tyne, behind the doors of an ordinary terraced house, a relationship was quietly curdling into something dangerous. Peter McMahon was a 68-year-old retired civil servant, a father to 2 sons, a man described by his family as generous, trusting and soft-hearted. He lived a simple life in Newcastle's East End and was known for his kind-hearted nature. But Peter's kindness had unfortunately made him her target. After becoming involved with Sharon Swinhoe 10 years prior and falling for her charming offensive, he became deeply infatuated with her. Swinhoe was 24 years younger than McMahon, and by the time they met, she already had a reputation for drawing in vulnerable men. In court, prosecutors would later describe McMahon as besotted. He bought her gifts, he gave her money, he believed, or desperately wanted to believe, that her affection and loyalty could be rewarded and encouraged through generosity. To Swinhoe, however, he was simply useful, another man she could exploit for her own gain. Living on the edges of Sharon's life was another man, Joseph Collins, her on-off partner. Collins was volatile, insecure and increasingly resentful of McMahon's presence. The dynamic between the three was unstable, a triangle fueled by jealousy, dependency and money. By October 2012, tensions inside Swinhoe's home in Walker were boiling over. What happened next unfolded behind closed doors, away from witnesses, but the jury later accepted a grim reconstruction of events. Peter McMahon, who had been lured to the home of Swinhoe on the evening of the 18th of October 2012, was subjected to a sustained and brutal attack inside her home. There is no indication of what started the altercation. It was suspected that it could have been a manipulationary tactic by Swinhoe to have Collins help her murder McMahon, by convincing Collins that he had assaulted her, but the true reason as to why the violence began was never fully revealed. What was revealed, however, was that the violence was intimate and frenzied. McMahon was beaten repeatedly. During the assault, Swinhoe had even partially gouged out his eyes with her long fingernails, injury so severe they triggered cardiac arrhythmia, causing his heart to fail. He died there, inside the house, at the hands of people he trusted. There was no call for help, no attempt to save him. Instead, what followed was a devious calculation. Rather than contacting emergency services, Swinhoe and Collins focused on concealment. McMahon's body was first dumped into a dog kennel, then stuffed into a suitcase, zipped shut and wheeled through the streets of Newcastle under cover of darkness. The destination was a Crudders Park tower block flat in Elswick, where Collins lived. There, Peter's body was removed from the suitcase and hidden inside a freezer. Days passed, then weeks. In that time, Swinhoe continued to withdraw money from McMahon's bank account, cashing in quite literally on his absence to the tune of £2,660. To the outside world, he was simply missing. Only Swinhoe and Collins knew the truth. In December 2012, 6 weeks after his murder, after following up on leads they had uncovered in their investigation, police made a discovery that would shock even seasoned detectives. Inside the Crudders Park tower block flat, officers opened the freezer and found the mutilated body of Peter McMahon. The murder investigation that followed exposed a story not just of violence but of exploitation. Prosecutors described Swinhoe as controlling, manipulative and emotionally predatory, someone who attracted vulnerable men and drained them of what they could offer. When the case went to trial at Newcastle Crown Court in June 2013, Swinhoe attempted to shift the narrative. She claimed McMahon had been abusive throughout their relationship. She alleged assaults, false imprisonment and rape. She told the jury she feared him. But no charges had ever been brought against McMahon, and no one else could corroborate her story. Peter was known as a soft-hearted, kind and good-natured man, not someone who would subject others to such pain. Swinhoe also claimed Joseph Collins had killed McMahon, that he had punched him, panicked and confessed to her afterwards. Collins, however, denied this. The jury, who had sat in astonishment at what they were being told, heard everything and rejected their explanations. On the 25th of July 2013, Sharon Swinhoe and Joseph Collins were both found guilty of murder. Another man, Ronald Douglas, was found not guilty of murder but had already pleaded guilty to perverting the course of justice for helping conceal McMahon's body. The following day, sentencing was handed down at Newcastle Crown Court. Sharon Swinhoe was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Joseph Collins received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. And Ronald Douglas was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Detective Chief Inspector Paul Young of Northumbria Police described the case as deeply disturbing, particularly what was done to Peter McMahon after his death. For Peter's family, the details were almost unbearable. They described him as a gentleman, a loving father, a man excited to become a grandfather. His life ended not in violence alone, but in indignity. In February 2021, Sharon Swinhoe passed from complications due to COVID in HMP Newhall while serving her quarter-of-a-century sentence. It was a calm summer night on Saturday the 8th of July 2006. In Benwell, on Benwell Grove in Newcastle's West End, the Purcell family's end terrace home was the sort of place that looked safe by default. Curtains drawn, front step worn smooth, neighbours close enough to hear your door. Inside lived Peter Purcell and his wife Josephine, known as Josie, both in their 70s. Their sons, Keith and Glenn, still moved in and out of the house like it was the family's anchor. And living there too was their nephew, David Bradley, a former Royal Artillery private, a Gulf War veteran, and a man whose mental health had been spiralling. In the spring of 2006, his GP referred him back into secondary mental health services. There were appointments, concerns, and then, like so many stories, gaps. On Saturday the 8th of July 2006, the day started off normal, but as the day wore on, Bradley began to grow agitated. He complained of feeling hot and bothered and began to smash up his room. Later that evening, the violence began. It started with a fight between Bradley and his cousin Keith. For reasons unknown, the two had a set to and a brawl burst out. As things escalated, Bradley grabbed a gun he had swapped for cigarettes and then smuggled into the UK from Bosnia while serving in the army. And the massacre began. The first shots came at close range. He picked up the gun and pointed it towards 40-year-old Keith Purcell, firing the gun point blank towards him, ending his life with a direct hit to the head. Suddenly, the monster was loose, and it would wreak carnage and devastation before it would return to its cage. Next, Bradley made his way downstairs where Peter Purcell, his 70-year-old uncle, was lying asleep on the sofa. As he raised the barrel of the gun and aimed it towards his uncle, Peter never even knew what was coming. Bradley, his hands steady as he took aim at his loving family member's head, pulled the trigger as his uncle slept, firing bullets into his body that ended his life immediately. Then, the house fell into a sickening stillness. One man alive inside it, two bodies close by, and time dragging on as he waited for the others to return. Just before 11 p.m, the silence was broken. His aunt Josie returned, walking in through the front door. Bradley, who had been lying in wait, ready to carry out his evil plan, immediately leapt from his cover and began shooting. Josie, stunned by the attack, didn't even have time to react. She was shot in the head at point-blank range and fell to her death where she lay. At this point, Bradley didn't panic or suddenly come round and get help. Instead, he stuck to his devious plan. He had one more target he had to dispatch before his murderous rampage was over. Hours later, at around 2:15 a.m, 41-year-old Glenn Purcell, the second son of Peter and Josephine, returned. As he walked into the kitchen, Bradley, who was again waiting in ambush, fired his gun repeatedly towards him, with 4 bullets striking Glenn in the head. He, like Peter and Josie, didn't have time to react. When it was finally over, 4 members of the same family, Peter, Josie, Keith and Glenn, were all laid dead, slain by a monster in their own home. Then came the part that chilled the city almost as much as the murders: the calm and deliberate walk to the police station. At around 6 a.m. on Sunday the 9th of July, David Bradley walked into Westgate Road Police Station, what locals called the West End Station, carrying a hold-all. Inside it was an arsenal, a handgun fitted with a silencer, a shotgun and ammunition. He told officers they would find 4 bodies at a house on Benwell Grove. Then he said the bag contained a bomb. The station and surrounding streets were evacuated while bomb disposal experts were called in and a controlled explosion was carried out. At the same time, armed officers were sent to the house and entered later that morning. Downstairs they found the bodies exactly where he'd said they would be. Peter and Josie in the living room, Keith and Glenn in the kitchen, all 4 slain by someone who had pretended to care for them. Benwell tried to process the impossible. Flowers were laid outside the home by friends and relatives. The Venerable Bede Church opened its doors for prayers. People spoke about the Purcell's roots on that street and how quickly a normal night had been rewritten into a crime scene. The investigation moved fast because Bradley had effectively handed himself in. He was arrested and charged with murder, but the courtroom story shifted. When the case reached Newcastle Crown Court in January 2007, the plea came on the morning his murder trial was due to begin. He admitted the killings, but pleaded guilty to 4 counts of manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility, after psychiatric evidence that he had been mentally ill at the time. In April 2008, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. After sentencing, he was transferred to Rampton Special Hospital, where, as far as I was able to find, he still resides to this day. Kenton is the kind of Newcastle suburb that feels like it was built for families. Semi-detached houses, above average performing schools, plenty of green space and streets that go quiet when the lights come on at night. On Hawthorne Gardens, behind one of those doors, Olafunke Sobo, known to many as Funky, was doing what she always seemed to do, keeping the household moving. She worked at Asda. Her brother, Yemi Sobo, a freelance photographer, was staying in the house while his own place was being refurbished. And upstairs were the children, 12-year-old Abigail Crampton and 5-year-old Stephen Crampton. Funky and her family lived in her mother Omatunde Sobo's semi-detached home. In November 2006, Omatunde, or Tunde as friends called her, was away on a trip to Nigeria. During this trip away, Funky's personal life was beginning to show strains. Recently, she had gone through a breakup with the father of her children, and the turmoil was taking its toll. Funky's relationship with her estranged partner Neil Crampton had become unstable, on and off, tense and threaded with jealousy. He was an ex-taxi driver living with his own parents Bill and Anne Crampton at Huntley Crescent in Winlayton, Gateshead. The distance between those two addresses wasn't far, but emotionally it might as well have been a border. In the weeks leading up to the night of Monday the 13th of November, Crampton had become more and more jealous and possessive, constantly accusing Funky of seeing other men, even though he had no proof. It was later reported that Crampton was constantly increasing in paranoia, worried that Funky would find someone else and that upon her mother's return, Funky's resolve to leave the relationship would be strengthened by her mother's presence. Then it came to a head. On the night of Monday the 13th of November 2006, neighbours would report hearing a disturbance at around 11 to 11:30 p.m. Somewhere in that window of time, the house on Hawthorne Gardens became the setting for a brutal attack. Crampton, feeling pressure to act by his ex-partner's mother's imminent return, made a decision to carry out a heinous and evil plot. He made his way to Funky's house, where his kids lay in their beds and his ex and her brother were resting, with a knife in his pocket and hate-filled paranoia in his head. When he arrived at the property, he knocked on the door and waited, and when the door was answered, he sprang into action without a shred of remorse. As Funky opened the door, he pounced. Knife in hand, he began his murderous onslaught, stabbing the mother of his children again and again in the stomach, chest, shoulder, arms and head. As he attacked, Funky's brother Yemi heard the commotion and ran to her aid, desperate to stop the attack. Unfortunately for him, however, Crampton simply turned his intentions towards him. As Yemi heroically stepped in, desperately trying to wrestle the knife from Crampton's hands, Neil attacked hard, stabbing at Yemi with the knife. With nothing other than his hands to protect himself, Yemi was stabbed and slashed multiple times in the torso and arms, with Crampton eventually overpowering him and murdering him there in the hallway. Upon murdering Funky and Yemi, you might have been forgiven for thinking his evil plan was now complete. Unfortunately, however, it was not. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. After killing his ex and her brother in cold blood, Neil Crampton decided to turn his attention towards his own children. Not content to simply murder their mother, this monster of a man also wanted to assassinate his own kids. First he sought out Abigail, his 12-year-old daughter, who was cowering frightened in the living room. Approaching her with evil intentions, she tried desperately to fight back, but unfortunately she was no match for such a monster. Neil began a vicious onslaught, stabbing and slashing his own daughter repeatedly until her life was extinguished and she lay there on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Once Crampton had coldly eliminated his daughter, he then made his way upstairs where his innocent 5-year-old son Stephen was sleeping, oblivious to the massacre happening below him. Upon reaching his son's bedside, without hesitation, Crampton began another onslaught, plunging the knife into him 25 times as he lay there, leaving him dead where he slept. Having now carried out his cruel plan, it is unclear exactly what he did next. However, from the sheer amount of injuries inflicted on the bodies, it is possible that Neil spent time administering more stab wounds to some of his victims after they had already passed. What is known, however, is that by around 8:45 am, Neil was ready to enact the next part of his plan. At around 8:50 am on the morning of the 14th, police received a call from a male voice. Detective Superintendent Steve Wade would later say the caller claimed he was responsible for killing his entire family. The words were blunt: "I've murdered my entire family." Just before 9:30 a.m, officers forced entry into the house. Investigators said it was apparent the family had been subjected to a sustained and violent attack. But as police investigated the crime scene, the killer was nowhere to be seen, and so a manhunt was soon underway. That same Tuesday morning, Tunde Sobo, Funky's mother, arrived back from Nigeria to find her street sealed off with a police cordon and to learn what horrific circumstances had taken place within her home. While speaking with officers about the situation, Tunde told police about her daughter's ex-partner and how she believed it could be him who had committed such an atrocity. Neil Crampton was then arrested several hours later as he returned to his parents' home in Winlayton. He needed medical attention before he could even be interviewed, and police then made it clear they were not looking for anyone else. Within days, Neil Crampton was charged with murdering Funky Sobo, their children Abigail and Stephen, and Funky's brother Yemi, and the long battle for justice began. The legal fight that followed was about responsibility. In April 2008, it was reported that a plea of guilty to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility was rejected by the Crown. Later, at Newcastle Crown Court, a jury heard that the scene that met police on their arrival to the home was described as like a scene from a horror film. A post-mortem investigation, which took over 2 days due to the significant number of injuries inflicted upon each victim, revealed that Crampton used a large kitchen knife to stab and slash his victims to death, describing the amount of times he stabbed each individual as maniacal and abhorrent. It was also found that Funky, Yemi and Abigail had defensive wounds on their hands and arms, injuries that speak for themselves, telling of moments when survival was still being fought for. As the jury was informed of the amount of times Crampton struck with the blade, they winced in terror. Stephen, Neil's son, was stabbed a total of 25 times, and Yemi Sobo, Funky's brother, was stabbed 67 times. Abigail, his own daughter, he stabbed 105 times, and Funky, the loving mother of his 2 children, he stabbed a total of 108 times. The courtroom was stunned into silence, and upon their deliberation, the jury rejected his plea of diminished responsibility in just 3.5 hours and found him guilty of all 4 murders. And on the 25th of November 2008, he was then sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. The judge, Mr. Justice Alan Wilkie, said, "I am satisfied you were fully responsible for your actions, and you showed no mercy during the attack." It was later recorded that Crampton showed no emotion at all as he was taken down to serve his sentence. On Saturday the 6th of June 2015, a body was discovered on a grass bank in Forden, Newcastle upon Tyne, not far from 33 Studden Walk and within earshot of the constant roar of the A1. Traffic passed as it always had, indifferent and unaware that a young man's life had just come to a quiet and brutal end. Emergency services arrived, assessed the scene and then left again because there was nothing left to save. The young man lying there was 24-year-old Lee Irving, and as detectives began to piece together how he had ended up on that patch of ground, it became clear that the most disturbing part of his story was not where he died, but where he had been dying for days beforehand. Lee was a vulnerable adult with significant learning disabilities. Formal assessments placed his IQ firmly within the learning disability range, but to those who didn't know him well, that vulnerability was not always obvious. He was physically capable, determined and eager to be accepted. Professionals would later reflect that his outward confidence could mask the reality of how exposed he truly was. That quiet need for friendship and belonging became the doorway through which the wrong people stepped. In the weeks leading up to his death, Lee began spending time at a house on Studden Walk in Kenton. Inside number 33 lived James Wheatley, his mother Julie Mills, his then partner Nicole Lawrence, and an associate Barry Imrie. To Lee, this was companionship, a place to sit, to talk, to feel included. But inside that house, the dynamic was shifting into something far more sinister. Between the 28th of May and the 5th of June 2015, Lee suffered repeat violence. The court heard that he was kicked, punched and stamped on, not in a single uncontrolled moment, but across multiple assaults. The injuries were devastating. 27 fractures to his ribs, a broken nose and jaw, extensive bruising, lacerations and trauma described by experts as comparable to serious car crash injuries. As Lee's body deteriorated, what happened next turned cruelly into something even darker. No ambulance was called, no urgent trip to hospital was made. Instead, Lee was sedated with drugs including morphine and other medications, keeping him subdued and manageable as his condition worsened. Police later revealed messages were sent between those inside the house, some later described in court as casually referencing the extent of the injuries. One message from Julie Mills described Lee's state as a bloodbath. As his breathing became laboured and his condition critical, internet searches began appearing for symptoms such as bruising, dehydration, bleeding on the brain and blood clots. It read like a frantic attempt to understand the consequences of what had been done, without ever taking the one step that might have saved him. Lee Irving ultimately died from respiratory failure caused by the extensive injuries inflicted upon him, but even then, dignity was denied. On instructions from James Wheatley, Barry Imrie moved Lee's body in a pushchair for around 800 metres, taking him away from the house on Sudden Walk and leaving him beside a footpath near the A1. Efforts were made to present the discovery as something accidental, as though Lee had simply collapsed there. But post-mortem findings told a different story, and digital evidence began to draw a straight line back to the house where he had spent his final days. On the 9th of June 2015, arrests of all involved were made. What followed were lengthy legal proceedings, including a mistrial and retrial before the case concluded at Newcastle Crown Court in December 2016. After an 8-week trial, the jury found James Wheatley guilty of murder. Barry Imrie was convicted of causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. Julie Mills and Nicole Lawrence were convicted of causing or allowing death and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. On the 2nd of December 2016, Mr. Justice Sewell sentenced Wheatley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years, describing him as a vicious and brutal bully who targeted someone who could not defend himself. Mills, Lawrence and Imrie were also jailed for 8, 4 and 3 years respectively. But in March 2017, the Court of Appeal increased Mills and Lawrence's sentences from 8 to 10 years and 4 to 7 years after intervention under the unduly lenient sentence scheme. In the aftermath, an official safeguarding review examined how a vulnerable adult could fall so deeply into danger without an effective coordinated rescue. And perhaps that is the most haunting detail of all. Lee Irving did not die in a moment of sudden chaos. He died slowly, inside a home surrounded by people who saw his suffering and chose not to stop it. He went looking for friendship and instead found himself in a place where his vulnerability became entertainment, inconvenience, and finally, something to dispose of. Now, if you took something from this video, you might also like to watch the video on screen now, where I discuss the case of the UK's forgotten cannibal killer, who lured his boyfriend into bed, then murdered him in cold blood and cooked and ate pieces of him before confessing all to police. And, as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one, when it'll once again be time for more true crime.